September 7, 1945. Fort Lewis, Washington. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his face against the transport truck's canvas flap, watching towering evergreens pass by like silent sentinels. After months in cramped submarine quarters and the suffocating darkness of the holding facility in Hawaii, even captivity felt like breathing again. Then the truck turned a corner, and Yamamoto saw something that made him forget he was a prisoner of war. Rising above the tree line, impossibly massive and gleaming white against autumn sky, stood a mountain so perfect it seemed drawn by a master artist. He stared, unable to process what his eyes were telling him. It had to be painted on canvas, some elaborate backdrop meant to mock them. Nothing in nature could be that flawless, that symmetrical, that utterly magnificent. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Yamamoto did not know was that this moment of disbelief would mark the beginning of a transformation more profound than any military defeat, a journey that would challenge everything he had been taught about his enemy and himself. The camp had been prepared with typical efficiency. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, but the atmosphere was nothing like what the Japanese officers expected. Commander Yamamoto had been briefed about the barbarism of Western powers, about how prisoners could expect torture and starvation. Instead, as they were processed, each man received new clothing, bedding, and toiletries. The Red Cross representative explained through an interpreter that they would receive 3 meals daily, access to medical care, and the ability to send limited correspondence home. That first night, lying on an actual mattress with sheets, Yamamoto could not sleep. Through the window, Mount Rainier dominated the southern horizon, its peak catching sunset rays and turning deep pink. He watched for hours, convinced the illusion would fail, that wind would make canvas ripple or rain would smudge paint. But the mountain remained, solid and serene, 14,410 feet of volcanic rock and ice that had stood there for more than 500,000 years. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, who had been Yamamoto's communications officer aboard the submarine, approached the window. He was 26 years old, educated at the Imperial Naval Academy, fluent in English, and utterly bewildered. In a low voice he said, "Commander, that cannot be real. The Americans are known for their cinema, their special effects. This must be some projection meant to intimidate us." Yamamoto wanted to agree, but something in him resisted. He had studied geology at university before the military consumed his life. He knew the Pacific Ring of Fire, knew volcanic peaks existed throughout the ocean basin. But seeing one this enormous, this close, created a cognitive dissonance that was almost painful. Everything he had been taught about American weakness seemed suddenly suspect. A nation that possessed such natural grandeur, that could casually house prisoners in the shadow of such magnificence, might be far more formidable than Tokyo had ever acknowledged. The next morning brought their first proper meal in captivity. The mess hall smelled of coffee and bacon. Yamamoto and 53 other prisoners lined up with metal trays, shuffling past American soldiers, who served generous portions without comment or contempt. Scrambled eggs, actual eggs, bacon, strips of crispy pork that tasted like luxury, toast with butter and jam, coffee hot and bitter and perfect, and fruit, fresh apples from Washington orchards, crunchy and sweet. Ensign Kenji Sato, the youngest at 19, sat down with his tray and simply stared at it. Tears ran down his face. He had not seen food like this since leaving home 18 months earlier. Even then, with Japan's resources stretched thin, meals had become meager. Aboard the submarine, they had subsisted on rice and pickled vegetables. He picked up the apple with both hands, as if it were sacred, and took a small bite. The taste made him weep harder. Captain James Morrison, the camp's deputy commander, watched from the doorway. He was 42, a career officer who had seen combat in the First War. He understood the psychology of what was happening. These men had been prepared for hell and instead found relative comfort. The cognitive dissonance was a weapon more powerful than any interrogation. In his daily report, he would write that prisoners continued to express disbelief at basic camp conditions and that enemy morale was deteriorating rapidly under humane treatment. After breakfast, prisoners were assigned work details. Most volunteered, desperate for something to occupy their minds. Yamamoto's group was sent to the camp vegetable garden under supervision of Sergeant Robert Chen, a Chinese-American soldier who spoke fluent Japanese and possessed a wry sense of humor. As they worked, pulling carrots and turnips from rich Washington soil, Mount Rainier loomed before them like a judgment. Sergeant Chen noticed their constant glances and decided to address it. He called for a water break and gestured toward the summit. In perfect Japanese, he said, "You are wondering if it is real. I assure you it is. The local tribes called it Tahoma, Mother of Waters. It is a stratovolcano, active but dormant. On clear days, you can see it from Seattle, 60 miles north. It is very, very real." Nakamura, who had been elected spokesperson, spoke carefully. "Sergeant, we mean no disrespect, but such mountains do not exist in our experience. Mount Fuji rises 12,388 feet and is considered extraordinary. This mountain appears taller and more massive. It seems impossible we never knew of it." Chen sat down on a crate and lit a cigarette, offering the pack around. He exhaled slowly and said, "Here is what you need to understand. America is enormous. Your entire nation would fit inside Montana with room to spare. We have deserts that go for days, forests beyond sight, plains so flat and endless you can watch your dog run away for 3 days. And we have mountains, lots of them. Rainier is not even our tallest. That would be Denali in Alaska, 20,310 feet. He paused, letting the information sink in. "And here is the thing that should really concern you. We have so many resources, so much space, so much productive capacity that we can afford to feed you better than your own military fed you. We can afford to house you in wooden barracks with heating. We can afford all this while simultaneously building ships, planes, and tanks faster than you can destroy them. In 1944 alone, we produced 96,000 aircraft. Your entire Air Force at peak was perhaps 6,000 planes. Think about that while you look at the mountain." The silence that followed was profound. These men had been told America was weak, soft, corrupted by luxury. They had been assured that Japanese spirit would overcome material disadvantage, but spirit could not argue with a mountain that towered like a god. Spirit could not explain how their captors seemed casual about resources that would have been unthinkable luxuries in Japan. That evening, after another substantial meal, prisoners were allowed recreational time. Yamamoto stood at the fence, watching sunset paint Mount Rainier in shades of orange and purple. A guard approached, a young private named Michael O'Brien from Wisconsin. O'Brien leaned against the fence and followed Yamamoto's gaze. In slow English, he said, "Beautiful, isn't it? First time I saw Rainier, I thought the same thing, too perfect." He pulled out a photograph. "This is my family's dairy farm, 160 acres. We milk about 50 cows. My brother runs it now while I'm here." Yamamoto understood enough English to follow. He replied slowly, "My family, fishermen, small boat. 3 generations, same boat." O'Brien nodded. "My granddad came from Ireland with nothing, built that farm from scratch. That is what I am fighting for. Not to conquer anybody. Just to make sure my brother can keep milking those cows and raising his kids. Most of us, we are just fighting to protect what we have. Do not really understand why it had to come to this." The conversation was simple, almost banal, but it represented something unprecedented for Yamamoto. He had been taught that Americans were fundamentally alien, motivated by greed, lacking deep cultural values. But O'Brien was talking about the same things any Japanese fisherman would discuss: land, family, continuity, tradition. The cognitive dissonance grew stronger. Over following weeks, as autumn deepened into winter, prisoners settled into a routine that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Mount Rainier became a constant presence in their discussions, a symbol of everything they were struggling to understand. Lieutenant Nakamura started keeping a journal. One entry from late October read, "Today we helped repair the camp generator. The American sergeant explained that this same design is used in factories across their country, hundreds of thousands of units, all interchangeable, all mass-produced. He said they manufacture them like we might manufacture rice bowls, but with precision engineering. Everything here speaks of abundance and systems, of a civilization that has solved problems we are still struggling with. The mountain watches over all of it, serene and eternal. The camp library became a gathering place for those who read English. Yamamoto spent hours there, working through books on American history and geography with a dictionary beside him. He read about the Transcontinental Railroad, built across mountains and deserts. He read about the Tennessee Valley Authority, an entire river system reorganized to generate power. He read about assembly lines that could produce a bomber every hour, about shipyards that launched cargo vessels faster than submarines could sink them. Each fact was like a hammer blow to his worldview. One book captured his attention, a survey of American resources. The statistics were staggering. The United States produced nearly 60% of the world's oil, 70% of its automobiles, 40% of its coal. It grew enough food to feed itself and export massive surpluses. And all of this existed beneath mountains like Rainier, spread across a continent that dwarfed anything in the Pacific. In early December, as first serious snow fell on Mount Rainier, the camp organized an educational program. Once weekly, interested prisoners could attend lectures taught by volunteers from the local community. It was part of a strategy to re-educate enemy captives. The first lecture was delivered by Professor Harold Whitman from the University of Washington, a geologist who specialized in volcanic systems. Through an interpreter, he explained the geology of the Cascade Range, the tectonic forces that had built mountains from California to British Columbia. Then he focused on Mount Rainier specifically. The mountain was not just tall but extraordinarily massive, with more than 1 cubic mile of ice covering its slopes, 26 named glaciers in total. The peak was visible from over 100 miles away on clear days. It created its own weather patterns. He showed photographs from various distances, proving the mountain they saw was real. Yamamoto raised his hand. Through the interpreter, he asked, "Professor, why did we never learn of this mountain? How could something so significant be overlooked?" Whitman considered carefully. "Commander, the answer reveals something about the nature of nations and limits of knowledge. America has hundreds of significant features. We have the Grand Canyon, so vast it creates its own ecosystem levels. We have Yellowstone, with geothermal features found nowhere else. We have the Great Lakes, containing 21% of the world's surface fresh water. Any one of these would define a smaller nation, but we have all of them, spread across such distance that even most Americans have not seen them all. Your planners likely focused on naval bases and industrial centers. Mountains, no matter how magnificent, did not seem relevant to warfare, but they represent something crucial, the depth and diversity of the land you were fighting against." That exchange stayed with Yamamoto. The mountain was not hidden. It had been here for 500,000 years. The failure to know about it was a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive of a nation so large it could casually contain wonders like this, without them being central to its identity. As winter settled in, the prisoners were physically comfortable, but psychologically in turmoil. Every aspect of captivity contradicted the narrative that had sent them to war. They had been told sacrifice was necessary because Japan lacked resources. Yet here they were in a land so rich even prisoners ate well. They had been told American individualism made the country weak. Yet the camp operated with mechanical efficiency. They had been told Japanese culture was unique and superior. Yet in conversations with captors, they kept finding the same fundamental human concerns: family, home, dignity, purpose. The camp's chief medical officer, Dr. Sarah Chen, provided another bewildering window. She was female, Chinese-American, and held rank equivalent to a captain. By Japanese standards, each fact was nearly impossible to process. Women did not serve as military officers. Minorities were not placed in positions of authority. Yet here she was, treating prisoners with the same care she would give American soldiers. Ensign Sato developed a persistent cough. Dr. Chen treated him with antibiotics, real penicillin distributed so widely that even enemy prisoners received it. As she examined him, she made small talk through the interpreter, asking about his family, his education, his life before war. Sato found himself answering honestly, describing his mother's flower shop in Osaka, his love of mathematics, his hope to become an engineer. Dr. Chen nodded as she made notes. She said, "My parents came to America from Guangdong province with almost nothing. They opened a small grocery in San Francisco. My father wanted me to be a doctor, kept saying education was the one thing that could never be taken away. He was right. I went to college on scholarship, then medical school. Then the army needed doctors, and here I am. In America, if you have ability and work hard, many paths open up. Gender and background matter less than in more traditional societies. It is not perfect, we have prejudices and barriers, but the system allows for mobility in ways that would surprise you. Sato processed this, then asked a question that had been troubling him. Doctor, were you not angry when war came with Japan? Do you not hate us? Dr. Chen put down her pen and met his eyes directly. Ensign, I am angry about a lot of things. I am angry that people are dying for reasons that seem insane when you step back. I am angry that young men like you are sent to fight wars started by old men who will never face consequences. But I am not angry at you specifically. You did not choose to be born Japanese any more than I chose to be born American. We are all just trying to survive the circumstances we were given. My job is to keep you healthy, and I will do it to the best of my ability because that is what a doctor does. Hate is exhausting and unproductive. I would rather save my energy for healing. This conversation, relayed through the barracks that evening, sparked intense debate. The concept of individual identity separate from national identity was fundamentally foreign to their training. They had been taught the individual existed to serve the collective. Yet, here was someone who claimed a professional identity and personal ethics that transcended national allegiance. By January, Mount Rainier was completely covered in snow, gleaming like a jewel against winter skies. The prisoners had stopped questioning whether it was real. Now they simply accepted its presence. But the mountain had done its work. It had been the first crack in their certainty, and through that crack other doubts and questions had flooded. A Red Cross representative arrived in mid-January with mail from home, letters routed through Switzerland and censored by both sides. Yamamoto received 2 letters, one from his wife and one from his father. His wife's letter was carefully cheerful, describing the flower garden, the health of his children, the kindness of neighbors. His father's letter was shorter and more formal, but included a sentence that struck deep. Remember that honor lies not in the manner of dying, but in the manner of living. That night, Yamamoto read the letters repeatedly, trying to decode what his father meant. In traditional military culture, capture was ultimate dishonor. But his father, a fisherman who had survived storms without military training to shape his worldview, was suggesting something different. He was suggesting Yamamoto's life still had value, that how he conducted himself in captivity mattered, that survival itself could be honorable. As winter gave way to early spring, news from the Pacific began penetrating the camp. American forces were advancing island by island, sometimes bypassing Japanese strongholds to let them wither without supplies. The submarine fleet had been systematically destroyed. Cities were being targeted by massive air campaigns. Prisoners learned these facts through official channels and unofficial conversations with guards who were increasingly relaxed around them. Each piece of news brought fresh anguish. Ensign Sato received notification that his family's home had been destroyed. They had survived by fleeing to countryside, but everything they owned was gone. The flower shop his mother had built over 2 decades existed now only in memory. Lieutenant Nakamura's journal entries grew darker. One from March read, "We were told we fought for our families, for our homeland. But what are we protecting now? The conflict continues, cities burn, and we sit here in comfort eating eggs and looking at a mountain. They have shown us that our understanding of the world was incomplete, that our leaders sent us against an enemy whose true nature we never grasped. The mountain stands indifferent, beautiful and eternal, mocking our certainty with its ancient patience." In April, the camp announced that the conflict in Europe had ended. Prisoners understood what this meant strategically. All of America's industrial might would now focus entirely on the Pacific. The outcome was no longer in doubt, if it ever had been. Camp Commandant Colonel Henry Patterson called an assembly. Through interpreters, he delivered a remarkably candid speech. He said, "Gentlemen, the situation in the Pacific is clear to any objective observer. Your country faces a choice between negotiated surrender and total devastation. I hope for the sake of innocent people on your home islands that your leaders choose wisdom over pride. You have been treated according to convention because we believe in civilized behavior. When peace comes, you will return home. What you carry back, the knowledge you have gained here, may be more valuable than anything you brought. Pay attention, learn, survive, and perhaps help build something better from the ruins. This surprisingly honest speech sparked another round of intense discussion. Some clung to hope that secret weapons might turn the tide. But most, worn down by months of evidence contradicting every certainty, began accepting the reality of defeat. The question became not whether Japan would lose, but what meaning they could salvage from the experience. In early August, news reached the camp that was incomprehensible. A single weapon, delivered by one aircraft, had destroyed an entire city in an instant. 3 days later, another city suffered the same fate. On August 15th, the Emperor himself spoke on radio, announcing surrender. Prisoners gathered in the mess hall to hear the official announcement. Many wept openly. Some sat in stunned silence. A few had to be restrained. But most, including Yamamoto, felt something more complex than simple despair. There was sorrow for lives lost and suffering endured. There was shame at defeat and fear of returning home. But there was also, surprisingly, relief. The conflict was over. No more cities would burn. No more young men would die for a cause already lost. The insanity could end. That evening, Yamamoto walked alone to the fence and looked up at Mount Rainier, bathed in golden late summer light. The mountain had witnessed the entire span from this vantage point, had stood here while ships burned and planes fell and men killed each other. It would stand for millennia after the last person who remembered this was gone. In its permanence, there was something oddly comforting. Human conflicts were temporary, even the most terrible ones. Nature continued. Life continued. Perhaps that was the lesson. Repatriation took months. First came verification, medical examinations and debriefings. Then logistics of transportation had to be arranged. During this waiting period, restrictions relaxed considerably. Prisoners were allowed more freedom, more contact with civilian community, more opportunities to see the world. A group of church members invited prisoners to a cultural exchange event in Tacoma. Under guard but treated as guests, Yamamoto and 15 others visited a community center where American civilians served tea and cookies and asked about Japanese culture, about traditional arts. It was surreal, sitting in a church basement, explaining Ikebana philosophy to American grandmothers who listened with genuine interest. One elderly woman, Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, whose grandson had been killed at Iwo Jima, sat next to Yamamoto and spoke through the interpreter. With heartbreaking directness, she said, "Young man, I do not know if you fired the weapon that took my grandson, but I know that hating you will not bring him back. I know he would want me to be better than that. So I choose to see you as someone's grandson too, someone's son, and I hope when you go home, you find peace and happiness and never have to fight again." Yamamoto, who had maintained composure through months of captivity, broke down completely. He wept before this grandmother, who had every reason to despise him, and instead offered compassion. Through tears, he tried to explain that he was sorry, that he never wanted the conflict, that he just wanted to go home to his wife and children and boat. Mrs. Fletcher patted his hand and said, "I know, dear, I know." On the drive back, nobody spoke. They passed through streets lined with houses and shops, saw children playing baseball in parks, watched ordinary people living ordinary lives. The city was intact, prosperous, functioning. There were no signs of destruction, no shortages visible in store windows, no sense of a nation being destroyed by prolonged conflict. Finally, in late November, orders came. They would ship out December 10th aboard a transport vessel to Yokohama. The final days were bittersweet. Several guards stopped by to say goodbye. Sergeant Chen gave Nakamura a book on American history with a personal note. Dr. Chen provided care packages of medicine and vitamins. Even Colonel Patterson shook hands with senior officers, wishing them well. On their last morning, Yamamoto woke before dawn and walked to the fence one final time. Mount Rainier was barely visible in pre-dawn darkness, a massive shadow against a sky beginning to lighten. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, From submarine service to capture to this camp in the shadow of a mountain he once thought was painted. He thought about everything he had learned, all the assumptions destroyed, all the certainties that dissolved. The mountain had been real all along. So was the nation that built itself around such natural wonders. So was the industrial power that had seemed impossible until he witnessed it directly. So was the capacity for kindness from people who had every reason to be cruel. All of it was real, and he had been blind because he was only shown what his leaders wanted him to see. That perhaps was the greatest crime, the deliberate cultivation of ignorance, the careful construction of a worldview that could not survive contact with reality. As sun rose, painting the mountain in shades of pink and gold, Yamamoto made a decision. He would not pretend captivity had been comfortable or that defeat was anything but devastating. But he would also not pretend the experience taught him nothing. He would return to Japan and rebuild his life, raise his children, repair his boat, return to the sea. And if anyone asked about the conflict, about what he learned in America, he would tell them about a mountain so magnificent that at first he thought it had to be a painting. He would tell them the world was larger and more complex than any propaganda could capture. He would tell them that former enemies could be kind and that humanity existed on both sides. He would tell them to be skeptical of anyone who claimed to have all answers, who promised easy victories. And he would tell them to look with clear eyes at reality, no matter how much it challenged comfortable beliefs. The prisoners boarded trucks for the last time, heading to the port. As they pulled away, Yamamoto looked back at Mount Rainier, now fully illuminated by morning sun, brilliant white against clear blue sky. The mountain would remain here, watching over this land, indifferent to human drama. But for the men who had seen it, who had been forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew, it would remain forever, as a symbol of the day reality proved more powerful than propaganda, when a mountain destroyed certainty more effectively than any weapon. The journey home took 3 weeks. When they reached Yokohama harbor, devastation was immediately apparent. The city had been bombed repeatedly, leaving vast stretches of rubble. Makeshift shelters housed families who had lost everything. People moved with the stunned expression of those who survived catastrophe but were not sure what came next. Yamamoto was processed through a repatriation center, where officials worked together to identify returning prisoners and arrange transportation. Within 2 days, he had papers allowing travel and small amount of occupation scrip. The train to his home village ran on repaired tracks, past fields being replanted, through towns beginning reconstruction. He arrived on a cold December afternoon to find his house damaged but standing. His wife ran to meet him, and they held each other without words. His children, older now and more serious, approached cautiously, not quite believing their father had returned. That night, around a small charcoal brazier providing their only heat, Yamamoto tried to explain where he had been and what he experienced. His wife listened quietly, absorbing the strange story of comfortable captivity and impossible mountains. When he finished, she said, "You are home now. That is what matters. The past is gone. We rebuild." In months that followed, Yamamoto did exactly that. He repaired his boat with help from neighbors who had also returned. He began fishing again, working the same waters his father and grandfather had worked. Life slowly found a rhythm, though different from before. Food remained scarce. Occupation forces were present everywhere, enforcing changes with systematic efficiency. The emperor remained but was no longer divine. The military was disbanded. Women gained the right to vote. Schools were reformed. Everything was changing rapidly. But Yamamoto, perhaps because of his experience at Fort Lewis, adapted more easily than most. He had already been forced to reconsider his fundamental assumptions. The occupation merely continued a transformation that had begun the day he saw Mount Rainier and thought it was a painting. He participated in village councils, advocated for practical solutions over ideological purity, and quietly encouraged younger men to embrace change rather than cling to the past that had led to disaster. Years later, when his son asked what the conflict taught him, Yamamoto thought carefully before answering. He said, "It taught me that the world is always larger and more complex than any single person or nation can fully understand. It taught me that certainty is dangerous, that the strongest beliefs should always be tested against reality. It taught me that enemies are rarely as evil as we are told, and allies are rarely as pure. Most importantly, it taught me that a mountain I thought was a painting was real, and if I was wrong about something so obvious and magnificent, I should always be willing to question what I think I know. Lieutenant Nakamura pursued his dream of becoming an engineer and eventually joined Toyota during its transformation into an industrial giant. He used principles of efficiency he had first encountered repairing generators at Fort Lewis. In his office, he kept a small photograph of Mount Rainier clipped from a magazine, a reminder of the moment his worldview cracked open. Ensign Sato became a mathematics teacher and spent 4 decades educating young people in critical thinking and scientific reasoning. He never forgot Dr. Chen's kindness or Mrs. Fletcher's forgiveness. In his classroom, he told students that honor came not from blind obedience, but from maintaining humanity, even in worst circumstances, from being willing to learn from anyone, even from enemies. Sergeant Chen returned to university and became a professor of Asian studies, promoting understanding between cultures that had been in conflict. His cousin, Dr. Sarah Chen, continued her military career and eventually became one of the first female generals in the medical corps. Both believed the small acts of dignity and education they provided to prisoners had contributed in some tiny way to Japan's eventual transformation into an ally. And Mount Rainier continued to stand, serene and eternal, watching over the Pacific Northwest as it had for 500,000 years and would for millions more. Each year, thousands of visitors hiked its trails, skied its slopes, and marveled at its beauty. Very few knew that once, during a conflict that nearly destroyed the world, a group of prisoners had looked at this mountain and thought it was too perfect to be real. They did not know that this moment of disbelief had been the beginning of a transformation, the first crack in a certainty that needed to be broken. They did not know that a mountain, simply by existing magnificently, had taught a lesson more powerful than any speech, that reality always defeats delusion, that the world is full of wonders we never imagined, and that recognizing our ignorance is the first step toward wisdom. The story of those prisoners became a small footnote in vast history, mentioned occasionally in academic papers, but never given attention afforded to strategy. But for the men who lived it, for their families who inherited their changed perspectives, it remained powerfully significant. They had been prepared to die for an ideology that could not survive contact with simple truth. They had been taught to fear and hate an enemy who instead fed them eggs and showed them mountains. And they had learned, in the most direct way possible, that the world was larger, stranger, and more generous than the small, frightened worldview they had been given. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.